Welcome to The Flirty Vegan, the podcast that motivates you to thrive through plant-based living. I'm your host, Jenny Shafitz, certified life, breathwork, and vegan lifestyle coach. After decades of dieting and deprivation, I found the secret to living a compassionate, nourished life. Whether you've been vegan for years or you're just flirting with the idea, prepare to be inspired by real people who courageously chose health and love. It's time to look better, feel better, and do better. Welcome to another episode of the Flirty Vegan Podcast. My name is Jenny Shafitz, and I'm so thrilled that you found your way here, whether you're a longtime listener or just discovering the show. I am supremely grateful that you're here listening, and I welcome your feedback. I would love to hear from you either in the comments of Spotify or YouTube, a DM on social media, or even an email, jenny@theflirtyvegan.com. I would love to hear what you are enjoying and maybe what you want to hear more of. Since transitioning this show to The Flirty Vegan, I have had the distinct honor of interviewing some really special people, all of whom identify as vegan. And their stories and journeys and mission work are all profoundly unique and deeply inspiring. So whether you're just curious about going plant-based to lower your cholesterol, or you've had the awakening that Gary Yourofsky mentioned in the last episode, the ethical revelation that has you questioning why you eat and wear animals, why there are zoos, rodeos, circuses, and testing done on animals. No matter what brought you to this moment in time, I am enormously thankful. And I hope you enjoy today's episode because this one is really fascinating. I grew up a Reform Jew and we practiced the religion, but I would not call my family super observant. And I certainly cannot quote biblical text or reference passages from the Torah. But I do have a connection to my faith, to my culture as a Jewish woman. So it brings me such joy to publish this episode on the 18th of March, 18 being a very special number in the Jewish religion. And it was just such a privilege to sit face to face across the screen, across the globe, with this man who is so wise and well-versed in Judaism. Rabbi David Rosen has served in many different roles around the world and has achieved countless recognitions and distinctions for his work in the realm of interreligious affairs and bridging gaps. Some of his most significant roles include his work as a rabbi in South Africa, his appointment to Chief Rabbi of Ireland, and I imagine, well, he didn't say this to me, I can pretty much assume he would also say his role as a husband, a father, and grandfather. We have a really interesting conversation in which I imagine listeners of all faiths will find meaningful. You'll hear that I ask him to explain aspects of the Old Testament and relate passages to modern day behaviors. So whether you are living a faith-based life, have any connection to religion, or simply appreciate that other people follow the teachings of their God, I am confident Rabbi David Rosen will bring something up to make you think and question the way you're living. It's just that kind of conversation. Now, before I share the actual episode, I want to tell you what's going on in the world of the Flirty Vegan. It's just about spring, which is when people start thinking about spring cleaning and rebirth, regrowth. So I am offering a 30-day challenge for the month of April, which is especially significant to me because it was April 2020 that I embarked on my massive personal growth transformation, and it all started with a 30-day challenge. So to honor that, I'm offering my own 30-day challenge. And just like the one I purchased 6 years ago, this is a $30 for 30-day challenge. You can find the link in the show notes or go directly to theflirtyvegan.com/30-day challenge to get the information and sign up. But basically, you'll get daily inspiration, Zoom calls, recipes, strategies, overall support to try 30 days of veganism. I know people say things like, you could do anything for 30 days, but I believe that is true in this case. I don't know that I buy it for jogging every day or even a 30 days of no complaining, which is on my list to try. But I promise you, a 30-day vegan challenge with the help and guidance of a coach is totally doable. In fact, it'll be energizing, invigorating, and hopefully life-changing. So check the show notes for the link, sign up. What do you have to lose? Seriously, when I think back on my 30-day beet binge eating challenge that I did with Brittany Brown, holy cow. And yeah, I really mean holy cow because I do think cows are holy. But for real, my life completely shifted because of that one $30 30-day challenge. So with the spirit of transformation and self-development, I bring you my conversation with Rabbi David Rosen. Well, this is a very special treat for me to have Rabbi David Rosen in my presence. I have tried following you and soaking up as much of your knowledge that I could find online, and it's just a real delight to have you here in the Zoom room with me. So, Rabbi David, welcome to the Flirty Vegan.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Happy to be with you.
Wonderful. Now, this show being called The Flirty Vegan, my hope is to invite more people into this beautiful lifestyle that we share. And I have really enjoyed having my guests share what first attracted them to the lifestyle. Again, this being a show called The Flirty Vegan, we are going to go with that theme as I ask you, what first attracted you to the world of veganism?
Well, there are actually many factors for me, but if I think back to my childhood, my instinctive response was that eating animals didn't seem to me to be the right thing to do. But I was brought up on a carnivorous diet, and I didn't really seriously think of giving it up until I was already a rabbi with a congregation. And there are a number of different factors, as I was saying. First of all, I had to be on the rabbinic court that supervised kosher provisions, and that meant I had to go to the slaughterhouses. And I had to check up on the slaughterers' knives to make sure that they were totally sharp so that there would be minimal suffering from the animals. And while I think that in fact these requirements do reduce the suffering to a minimum, it's still suffering and there's still
Mm,
cruelty involved. And the sites that I was involved in were horrific.
mm,
And I wouldn't want to do it. And that, first of all, posed for me the moral question. If you are benefiting from something you wouldn't want to do, is it right to benefit from the same action when others do it for you? That
mm.
seemed to me very problematic. And then there was some cancer in the family. I became more aware of the health aspects and issues related also to animal food consumption. I also read more and discovered that the idea of Jewish veganism was not something terribly new, and that there were plenty of sources within classical Jewish writings that saw this as an ideal and presented as such, and that were very captivating for me. Um, I became aware of the ecological issues and environmental issues and the damage done through animal product consumption and the production involved in it, and the enormous amount of wastage in terms of the famous comment that there's enough food for human need, but not enough for human greed. And I actually remember particularly the visit of a remarkable man whose name was Philip Pick. He was the founder of the Jewish Vegetarian Ecological Society in England, and really a pioneer he and his wife were already vegans, I think, before the Second World War.
Wow.
And they were really the pioneers, certainly amongst Jewish vegetarianism and veganism within the world. And at that time was a very young rabbi in South Africa before the government got rid of me, which is another story in itself. And he was visiting us, and we hosted him for a Friday night dinner. And I boasted to him that we had given up meat. And he said, but what do you eat on Friday night dinner? So I said, well, we have chicken. He said, how can you celebrate God's Sabbath with a carcass of a bird on your table? And it actually really struck me. And I
Mm,
thought, no, no, he's actually right. I think from that end, my wife and I decided we would give up all animal consumption, but we were still eating fish.
yeah.
But as we moved on our course, we realized that we could manage without that too, and it was desirable to do so. It took
Mm,
quite a while before we gave up dairy and then eggs. Probably giving up eggs was the most difficult of all.
mhm.
The fact that my wife was sort of lactose intolerant, or at any rate that dairy products didn't agree with her, certainly was an additional advantage. But all these factors then came together in what was, I would say, an evolutionary process, but an evolutionary process that confirmed an instinctive perception I had as a child.
Mm. Yeah, I love the way you tell that story. That's really compelling too. When you talk about that instinctive feeling, I've heard that from so many people who've said, when I was a child, I loved animals. I took care of wounded birds in the neighborhood and somehow managed to sit at the dinner table and eat their brethren. So at a certain point, that conflict, that inner conflict surfaced, and I did something about it. And so I love to hear that. I've told on this show many times that for me, it was an environmental documentary. It was not one of the classic vegan factory farming, the slaughterhouse horrors. It was really just the devastation of this beautiful planet, and that
Right.
my contribution as a meat eater was
Destructive.
devastating. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important because very often, especially something like global warming and climate change and the environment challenges we feel today, we very often are so overwhelmed by it all that we think that there's nothing we can do, whereas there are things we can do. And it things that we can do, even though they're good, things like recycling and avoiding wastage, they're all very important, but nothing has as dramatic an effect upon saving our planet as giving up animal product consumption and moving to a plant-based diet.
Yes. All right. So I told you I wrote down some bullet questions that I definitely wanted to ask you because I have this beautiful opportunity with you and I didn't want to miss it. But I'm going to go out of order based on what you just said. So I find that many people I encounter, whether I know them or they're just people in the universe, they acknowledge the problems and the injustices of the world. Things I've heard you mention, like the horrors in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, global warming. And so many people look at these problems and throw up their hands. What could I do? Now, as a religious leader, how can you encourage and I know this might sound opinionated, I apologize, but those complacent among us into action? What can you say to them when it comes to, well, I'm just one person and I can't solve war, I can't solve climate change?
Right. I think that it's easier to communicate the possibilities and the importance of a plant-based diet to impacting upon the environmental challenges of our time to people who are just overwhelmed, like the people whom we've been referring to before. And to be able to point out that this is a way, this really can have an impact and an effect. I think it's more difficult with those who are dismissive of the claims altogether and who either just say they don't care or think that they are victims of some great scam and use those arguments to be able to avoid having to change.
Yeah.
Um, and there, I think it's only if one can connect with a point of deep self-interest that you can have some kind of impact. Now, it's really very interesting. Within Judaism, of the value of saving life. It's called pikuach nefesh, saving life, is such a supreme value that anybody within the Jewish community, no matter how big a meat eater they may be, will acknowledge that as a value. And nobody's going
Mhm.
to deny that value. And therefore, that seems to be the key argument in terms of leverage towards the most recalcitrant and the most resistant. To be able to persuade them of the damage that the meat eating is. So, interestingly, there are those who can be persuaded by the light of doing good, but many more can be persuaded by the danger of allowing bad to continue and of the need
Mhm.
to avoid the bad. And if you put it in terms of, let's say, restricting the degree to which motor cars are allowed to go down the street, and you don't use the argument that this is generally necessarily polluting the environment, even though that's a very important argument, but that if you allow cars going to the street, your kids could be in physical danger, that's going to appeal to people more.
Right.
And so, and if you can show how the health hazards are really dangerous today, that because of all the pesticides and the antibiotics and so on and so forth that are pumped into animals and are necessary
Mm.
because of mass factory farming in order to avoid disease, and these are retained in the flesh and then transmitted into the human person, the damage that that's doing to the people and doing to their children, that
Mm.
I think is an argument, if it's presented out of a sense of care for the other's children and for their
Yeah.
family well-being that can get through. I think there's a special danger that comes from people like me, and that is the tendency to preach. Now, preaching, I mean, obviously there's good preaching and there's bad preaching, but I think that we've got to be very careful if we think that we can achieve our goals by being patronizing and derisive towards those who don't yet share them, then we are
Mhm.
deluding ourselves. We need to be compassionate ourselves in our relationship to those who perhaps are lacking compassion,
Yeah.
and to be able to find ways to be able to resonate with them and to connect with those points that can persuade them that there is a need for change. But change is a difficult thing for people to do lifestyle. In some ways, for an observant Jew, it's a little bit easier because you have all the kosher dietary laws and you're used to a dietary discipline, and therefore moving from one discipline to another is not so difficult. But
Mhm.
it's not without difficulty. And for people who are hooked, I mean, animal product consumption is a drug. People are hooked
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I can testify to that myself. How long ago was it I gave up meat? More than 45 years ago, something like 48 years ago. I don't know what it's like to go off drugs, as I've never been hooked on drugs, but I imagine it's the way I felt. I
Mhm.
really didn't feel good, and I really lusted to get my teeth into a juicy steak. And I was suffering for a couple of months until I got it out of my system. And then once it was out, I couldn't even think of eating meat again. And today, the very idea is repulsive. So it's conditioning for better, for worse, and for better.
Yeah.
And through that kind of conditioning, we get out of it. So I think to suggest to people that they need to immediately go cold turkey is probably counterproductive. One needs
Mhm.
to encourage people to reduce consumption and to keep on reducing it more and more till eventually it's out of their system.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so well said. So you mentioned kosher law. We're going to get back to that in a moment, but first, kind of to start off a slew of questions. Let's first recognizing that the listeners are not all Jewish. I don't actually know how to find out that information, so I'm going
Uh,
to assume we have a range of listeners.
That's very
They
good.
they do show to be predominantly midlife women, but regardless, many people believe the Bible, the Torah, all Scripture is up for interpretation. Now, I've heard you say, and you mentioned it before I press recording, I think, that the ideal society portrayed in the Bible is vegan. How would you respond to people who would then argue that that's simply your interpretation?
Well, it's very difficult to argue with a text which is explicit. So
Okay.
the Garden of Eden is the ideal society portrayed in the book of Genesis, in the first book of the Bible. And in that Bible, in that scenario, the first human beings, Adam and Eve, are given all the fruits of the trees and the vegetative products to be able to consume, and they are being introduced into a world where their diet is a vegan diet. The text is very clear that meat eating only becomes allowed to humanity after humanity has corrupted itself, the deluge that has come as a consequence, and as a concession for human needs. Now, what the person could come back to me and say is, well, okay, that's an ideal society, but obviously the Bible is making it clear that we don't have a perfect society and that we do live in an imperfect world. And in an imperfect world, an imperfect diet is also legitimate. And I can't argue with that. I can only say that we should strive to the degree that we are able to live as good a life as we can. And the less destruction, the less pain, the less suffering we cause, the healthier our lives, the healthier our environment, the better we are as human beings. And that means religiously, because living this world we, as religious people, we affirm is the divine creation. Therefore, the environment is the manifestation of the divine. Therefore, the human person who is defined as creating the divine image has to be respected as well. So the health and the well-being of humanity and the environment, etc., is a testimony of the degree to which one loves God. If one does not care about oneself and one's health and the well-being and the compassion and care for others in your environment, then you do not truly love God. And then I would go and say one stage further. Also, the ideal, I mean, is not only the Garden of Eden. Of course, the prophet Isaiah has this vision of the lamb and the lion and the wolf and the kid all lying down together. Okay, so there I would say that can be, there you could say that's not meant to be understood literally.
Mhm.
And you, David Rosen, trying to understand it literally, that's a matter of interpretation. That's a legitimate argument, but not with regards to Genesis. With Genesis, it's absolutely explicit. And then, secondly, I would say also with regard now, another argument my interlocutor could make would be, well, if it's so bad, then why does the Torah, the five books of Moses, why does it legislate for meat eating? You've got the whole areas of the laws of keeping kosher where it tells you what animals you can eat and what animals you can't eat. So obviously, if you can eat, it's okay to eat them. So
Mhm.
my answer would be that the Torah is full of legislation which is essentially concessionary. Divorce
Mhm.
isn't an ideal. It's a
Right.
recognition that sometimes relationships break down and you have to facilitate the best way how to be able to move out of that relationship. Slavery isn't an ideal. It's a concession to the way people were living at that particular time. And indeed, it's very clear in the Torah that it sees it as something negative by the fact that somebody who voluntarily gives up his own freedom and independence has to have a certain mark on his ear. The ear is sort of pierced as a sign of a degree of shame that the individual voluntarily gave up the freedom. But the whole of the legislation in the Torah is clearly taking into account our inadequate society, and it's trying to wean us in a positive direction. It's trying to take us away from things like slavery. It's trying to be able to raise a better way of life. And when it deals with the question of meat eating, the language that the Hebrew Bible uses is concessionary language. If you look at the legislation where it deals with those animals that are permitted to eat and not to eat. It says, if your heart's lust for meat, then so on and so forth, this is the way to do it. Lust is not a positive concept. It's a recognition that there are human needs that need to be accommodated. But if you can manage without accommodating these concessions, then obviously that's a better ideal.
Mm. Indeed. So in that explanation, I heard you use the word slavery, which I would imagine the majority of people on planet Earth would agree that slavery is not good. Now, it's something that has happened in human history, and to a large degree is happening still in various places. And I think that's one of those topics that people want to stick their hands in their ears, close their eyes, and la la la, because it's hard to imagine that in 2026 there is slavery taking place. And what a lot of people don't know, because it takes a lot of digging and research to learn these things, is that a lot of slavery is happening within the meat eating, meat production world, things like slaughterhouses, things like farming, things like tanneries. So how how does one explain, again, without wanting to sound preachy, soapboxy, self-righteous, that if you don't want to support, contribute to enslavement, how do you still manage to eat and purchase these products that are a result
That's
of
a
that?
that's a very difficult question because there are so many aspects of modern life in which we benefit from the exploitation of the vulnerable.
Hmm.
And perhaps the most dramatic and the most obvious is the clothing industry, the fashion industry and world, and
Yes.
where so it's very difficult to be able to live a modern life and be completely free of any connection with exploitation of human
For
beings.
sure, for sure.
All we can say is that we should try to be as free from such exploitation as possible
Right.
and do as much as we can. I'm not sure that that argument of human exploitation is the one that's going to cut the most water with carnivores from that
Right.
point of view, but it
Right.
certainly is a very valid point. I wouldn't actually call it slavery, but it's definitely terrible exploitation of people. The
Mm.
slavery, I think, today is above all in the exploitation of women and in sexual exploitation and the merchandising of women around the world, and especially people from impoverished countries where they've got really very little to be able to offer other than simply their bodies, and that's a terrible thing. Um, but I'm not sure it has enormous bearing upon essentially the questions of a vegan diet.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. So going back to that topic of interpretation, I would like to bring in the kosher laws. Now, I myself grew up Reform. I did not grow up in a kosher household, but I knew people who followed those laws and still know people who do. And I always heard them explain and claim that the kosher meat, the kosher, yeah, kosher meat was cleaner, kinder, more compassionate, I guess. And so I'd like for you to take a moment to speak to that opinion and
Right.
maybe debunk something.
Well, I might disappoint you actually
No?
in that regard because, well, certainly I don't think it's any cleaner.
Right.
Even though there may be aspects of the kosher laws that can be seen as contiguous with hygiene and may be influenced by hygiene factors, it's certainly clear uh, that there are many aspects of the dietary laws, not necessarily with regards to the specific creatures concerned, but the way these are applied in such a manner that resulted in levels of hygiene that were not common amongst the other peoples of the world at the time, and maybe right until modern times. Probably Jews did have a more hygienic um, homes and communities. And that was part of the reason, probably, that they didn't die from plagues in quite the same numbers as non-Jews around them, and was also part of the reason that many non-Jews suspected that Jews were behind the plagues precisely because they were
Mm.
not dying in quite the same numbers, same degree. But at any rate, I remember once I was asked when I was the chief rabbi of Ireland, I got an inquiry from a woman who was working on a thesis at Belfast University who was asking me for the sources of Jewish diet and health. And wrote back to her and I said, if you mean the Jewish dietary laws, here are the references. But if you're suggesting that the Jewish diet is necessarily healthy, I'm not sure you're right. I think with the amount of pickled and smoked and sticky and sweet stuff that the Jewish diet tends to consume, we've probably killed off more of our own than all our enemies put together. At any rate, getting back then to the serious question about whether these laws are more compassionate or not. So obviously for those of us who are vegan, the very idea that there can be any kind of laws that involve the slaughtering of animal can be called compassionate is very uh, paradoxical at
Yes.
best, if not
Mhm.
worse. But as somebody who, because I had to supervise the slaughtering of animals when I was on the rabbinic court in Cape Town and had to go to the abattoirs, the slaughterhouses. And interestingly, in Cape Town, the Jewish slaughterhouse, I don't suppose this was so rare and unusual, the Jewish slaughterhouse was a section of the larger slaughtering complex, the larger abattoirs. There were animals slaughtered on a very large scale for human consumption. And so I was able to see both Jewish slaughter and the general slaughter. And while I certainly agree that the Jewish slaughter looks far less aesthetic, and therefore visually it might be more problematic, in terms of the actual process, I think it is more compassionate. And I will tell you why. Even though kosher laws do not allow stunning of animals before the actual slaughtering. But when I went to the general slaughterhouse and saw how they were doing it, because of the demand, they're moving animals along an assembly line at a very rapid rate. And even though there are these electrical nodes hanging down from the roof, which there are, where there's somebody standing by and electrocuting animals one by one, stunning them before they're actually poleaxed and then killed, the pace in which the animals are going through is so fast that very often they're not doing it properly. And therefore, the degree to which the animals are being stunned is very often quite poor. And
Hmm.
then the way they're being killed is very, very brutal.
Hmm.
What you can say with the kosher process of slaughtering an animal is that even though it's very unesthetic, the animal has to be given personal attention. You have to get the animal down and you have to be able to slaughter its trachea and esophagus so there's immediate brain cessation of sensitivity. And so that even though it's ugly, I would say actually it is, in my opinion, in the end, more compassionate. But that's little comfort for the animal if it's
Right.
being slaughtered in a more compassionate way. And the other thing is you can see how even with sheep, which are the most docile of all, simply the smell of the blood and the slaughtering that's taking place, it's clearly terrifying them.
Yes.
And the problem isn't just the act of slaughter, the problem is the whole process up to the point of slaughter. It's the
Yes.
way the animals are treated, the way
Hmm.
they are force-fed in so many different areas, the confines they are limited to, the way they are transported.
Hmm.
Because you slaughter the animal the right way, at the end, at point Z, but you've ignored all the laws of care and compassion towards animals that Judaism lays down from point A to Y. How can you really say that's kosher? It's not enough simply the end act. There is a whole relationship with the animal life that is part and parcel of the Jewish way of relating to the natural world. Now, what's clear is that this concession was not just born at a time of where this was the norm, but maybe where there was also need.
Hmm.
In times in history, and certainly in many places of where we have lived, there have not been the conditions where you've had all the necessary natural nutrients to provide for a healthy diet. But today we can. Today, there's nowhere in the Western world where you cannot access these things. Therefore,
Hmm.
there's no real justification for this kind of slaughter and this kind of cruelty, even barbarity,
Hmm.
and for doing harm to human beings in the process. I mean, it's such an ironic thing that we do to systematically and intentionally harm our systems.
Hmm. And when I used the term slavery before, perhaps that was too harsh or too big of a word. But when you think about the people who work in the factory farming industry, their families, the people who live in the surrounding areas, that was kind of my broad scope of the unfairness, the injustice of it all.
Yeah, there definitely is. But as I say, in so many different areas of modern life, it's a paradox,
Hmm.
and it's a paradox here particularly because today people, in order to be able to pursue their indulgence of animal products, are supporting a system that is more cruel and barbaric than anything ever before in terms of human history's relationship between human beings and animals.
Yes.
And, our previous generations, and certainly if rabbinic authorities from ago would come today and see what goes on in slaughterhouses with kosher certification, they would be horrified. But because today people have become inured to it, they think that it's normative and normal and they accept what is in fact horrific.
Hmm. Yeah. And that was kind of my kosher question, was not referencing 1,000, 2,000, maybe even 100 years ago, but today, is kosher meat really something to put on a pedestal? I mean, I would argue no, but
So obviously for those of us who believe that a plant-based diet is not only the most healthy physical diet, but the most healthy spiritual diet, obviously that's not really kosher. I would say the only real kosher way of life today for the modern human person is a plant-based diet. That's real modern kosher food. Nothing else is really kosher. But obviously, again, that's in terms of an ideal, and I recognize that not everybody lives in the ideal, and therefore, as far as the Jewish community is concerned, I'd prefer them that if they do eat meat, that they eat kosher meat.
fair. In April 2020, my life was forever changed. And no, I'm not talking about the pandemic when everybody's life changed. I'm talking about when I saw an Instagram ad for Brittany Brown's 30-day challenge to beat binge eating. I didn't even hesitate. I clicked buy now, and that moment changed the course of my life. And I had the privilege of interviewing Brittany for my podcast, which is linked in the show notes. So here's what I'm doing. I'm offering a 30-day challenge for the month of April so that you can change your life for the better. Click the link in the show notes for details. Now let's get back to the show. Okay, so one last question as it pertains to interpretation. Uh, Dominion. Okay, so this word from scripture, there are many people especially of the carnivore uh,
Persuasion.
persuasion, thank you, who would say that's God made animals for us to eat them. That's why they're here. Can you speak to the biblical interpretation of
Yeah.
dominion?
So, first of all, the fact that God has created something doesn't mean that it's there for you to be able to exploit or to damage or to harm. And the Hebrew word that is translated as dominion, radu, comes from a root which means essentially to it means to be able to take responsibility for. And it certainly doesn't mean here that human beings can exploit the animal world without any care or consideration for its well-being. In fact, one of the greatest rabbis of the 20th century, who was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi in the land of Israel, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, points out that the very idea that this could be exploitation is, of course, in complete conflict with the passages such as those in Psalms that say God's mercies extend to all his creatures, and which we're obliged to be merciful to all God's creatures. And he points out that this is no more a mandate for humans to exploit animals than the permission for there to be a king is to exploit his subjects. Just as a king is meant to be responsible for the well-being and the flourishing of his subjects, so humanity here, with this word that is translated as dominion, is meant to exercise the responsibility to ensure the flourishing and the well-being of all animal or livestock and well-being.
Mm. I've heard you make that reference before, and I think of it, for in day-to-day life as a boss and employees. I mean,
Exactly.
you hear everyone every day discuss
Right.
their job and my boss, this type of person, but to think of a boss as abusive or dictatorial is horrific.
Right,
So we
exactly.
don't want that in our human world.
Right. And because you've been given a gift of perhaps a greater intelligence, that doesn't give you any entitlement to abuse it in any way. On the contrary, it means you have to use it in the most constructive way possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. I think you've probably spoken a little bit about this already, but I really want to drill it in. So people who follow I don't know, biblical life, a religious life, Jews and others, likely value compassion and believe that they're doing this is the kinds of expressions I'll hear people say, the Lord's work or a living. I interviewed someone who said something about the light of Jesus, the spirit of Jesus is within. Okay. What can you say to the people listening, religious folks who are listening, who are not yet vegan when it comes to being religious, being a follower of a faith, and yet not being vegan?
So again, if they are Jews or Christians, we've got a text already for them to be able to relate to, and that is the mandate specifically given to humanity in the Garden of Eden to develop and protect it. And therefore, that's what today we call sustainable development. And that sustainable development and healthy environment is a religious imperative. And if you're truly religious, you must be engaged in that. It's difficult for me to understand how people don't see that as obvious. A couple of years ago, I came into the States, and of course, as a foreigner, as an alien, I'm at border control, and I was on my way actually to a conference at Madison University that was dealing with issues of religion and environment. And the guy at border control said to me, where are you? What are you here for? And I said, I'm here to attend a conference. What's the conference on? Religion and the environment. And he says to me, what's religion got to do with the environment? I said, are you serious? Are you a religious person? I asked him. He said, absolutely. I'm a practicing Catholic. I
Right?
said to him, if you're a practicing Catholic, don't you believe that God created this world? Yes, of course I believe it. So that means that everything you see in this whole world is a manifestation of God's presence. That's the environment. How can you say what's religion got to do with the environment? He
Exactly.
said, I never thought of that. And that's the problem. People don't think of it. And therefore, the
Exactly.
important thing is to be able to emphasize that. This is a religious imperative. You have to care. If you don't care about your environment and about the well-being of humanity and of sentient life, you are not truly honoring God, creator and guide of the universe. And therefore, that's the most important thing we have to communicate. I actually would say for the Dharma religions, I think especially in terms of the Hindu tradition, there is so much that is of that consciousness within it that it's actually much easier to talk in this language actually to Hindus than often it is to Christians and Jews or Muslims.
Mhm.
So, but nevertheless, unfortunately, especially amongst the upper, higher socioeconomic levels within India today, there's been unfortunately a significant increase of carnivorous consumption. But when you speak to Indian people, even those who are more estranged from their religious tradition, and you start talking about the religious responsibility to honor the environment and honor creatures and sentient beings as a manifestation of the divine, then people do respond. Again, it's got a lot to do with the way you say things rather than what you're saying and how to be able to respond to people. But that's what we've got to continuously emphasize that environmental sustainability, care and compassion for animal well-beings, as well as for your own health, are all religious duties. These are not things that are divorced from religiosity. These are the very essence and the heart of a religious lifestyle.
I love that. I love that. That will definitely be extracted and shared on its own. That's a beautiful message. Now, you mentioned just now that the higher socioeconomic communities of India are appearing to be more carnivorous. We know I've learned elsewhere and heard it again from you that Israel is a very vegan friendly state. It's that's wonderful. I mean I've seen TV ads that have come out of Israel regarding veganism, and it's just a beautiful thing. I would argue that America seems to be on an upswing of carnivorous behavior. And I just would love to get your take on it. Why do you think, whether it's the wealthiest in India or everyone in America, because I don't think it's a I don't think it's wealth based. Why is there so much more energy behind this carnivore trend?
Well, first of all, I'm not really sure that your perception is necessarily a reflection of the full reality. It may be. I haven't seen scientific studies to be able to show the trends in terms of diets within the United States.
No,
But what
this
I
is
do,
anecdotal, so
right.
I
But
shouldn't.
what I do see is every time I come to the States, there are more and more vegan as well as vegetarian places, restaurants and places, opportunities and accessibility. And almost every restaurant, even a carnivorous one, will have a vegan options and things, etc., on their menu. I would say that a plant-based diet is becoming something more and more Americans know about and more aware of. Now, but nevertheless, I still acknowledge that it's a minority element, and there's still your question is has still validity with regards to the majority. And I would say two things. First of all, as I mentioned before, this is a drug. People are brought up on it, and therefore they have a craving for it and a certain need. Secondly, dead flesh and animal products are packageable and are saleable in a way that it makes it easy for the house husband or housewife to be able to just slap something into the microwave and put it on the plate. So it fits, I would say, a consumer society and a rapid society which doesn't prepare food properly or take much attention. And all this, I think, plays one thing into the other, and both the question of convenience as well as the question of habit and of familiarity. So it requires a little bit of a jolt to get people to understand that. But I actually think that there is more understanding of the damage that meat consumption does to people. Certainly more understanding of the health issues, perhaps, than the environmental issues or than care for the well-being of animal life. I think that in the end, the economic factors are going to really sway things in our favor. At the moment, alternative products, in other words, cultured meat, for example, or meat alternatives, are not always financially competitive at the moment.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
within a short period of time, they will be. And they will be so competitive that it will simply not make sense to be able to waste all the land and the water and the resources and everything involved. And slowly but surely, people will reduce their consumption of actual animal flesh, and they will start beginning to question it, and they will start looking at it as we look at smoking today, with a failure to understand how any healthy, normal, natural person would want to pollute their body like that. We will
Mhm.
get there. I believe that the majority of our society will become a plant-based society within a very short period of time, primarily because of economic factors, not because of our good sense and wisdom.
And frankly, who care? Right. I don't care. I don't care why. Just make it happen. I struggle as someone, a coach, an educator, someone who is just so excited about this mission and wanting to attract people to it, that I struggle when people speak so enthusiastically about meat eating. I mean, even yesterday, I was trying to draw someone into my content world, and I said, plant-based nutrition, and I try to present it from a health perspective. And she said, this was a direct quote, "I eat a very heart healthy carnivorous diet." And I thought, if ever there was an oxymoron, I don't understand. And I said, you do realize heart disease is the number one killer worldwide, dramatically linked to the saturated fat in animal products, the cholesterol that only exists in animal products. And yep, I just got that combative, I eat a heart healthy, meat-filled diet. And I said, bless and release.
Yes. I think the word oxymoron is a very good one. It's because they have the bad attitude towards the ox that they become morons.
I'm so glad you can bring humor into this conversation. It's so important. Thank you for answering all of those questions so clearly and deeply. What is your, I guess, approach on the daily to encourage plant eating?
So I suppose the simple answer to that is trying my best to give a good example. So if I think by, no, I'm already now approaching 75. I try to keep myself in good shape and I enjoy my food. I'm very blessed to have a wonderful a wonderful cook as my partner, a wonderful partner as my cook. I'm not quite sure which one to say, but
Love it.
I admit to my shame that I'm actually not much of a cook, precisely because I have such a wonderful partner who does
Perfect.
everything so well. And when people come, it's very traditional, very usual in traditional Jewish homes when you celebrate the Sabbath to have guests. And we have had guests from all over the world as well, all different strata of Israeli life and Jewish community, as well as, of course, from non-Jewish visitors. And very often, for very many, it's the first time they've been to a vegan home, and certainly
Mm.
within a Jewish religious community. And this for them is an eye opener that they can have such wonderful food and such wonderful celebration, enjoyment, and health and satisfaction from a diet that they haven't really contemplated before. So the more we can do that, I think, the more we spread the good word. And I get up into many places where conversation will very often go to a situation where I will start talking about this, and people are very often surprised. And I would say again, if you don't present it in a superior manner, then very often people are genuinely inquisitive and want to know more, and you can get your message across. So I would say that our responsibility as spiritual, sensitive, compassionate, plant-eating people is to be able to show a good example.
Now, what can you say to the people listening? uh, let's say specifically, well, I guess Jews or non-Jews who are so entrenched in their traditional religious foods. Okay, so for example, I have a friend who's let's say a conservative Jew who typically has roast chicken on Friday night. Then you have my mother-in-law's famous kugel recipe, which is heart attack in a pan. Latkes that are typically, the binding is egg. Jelly donuts, these things
Okay,
that,
so now you're getting into an area where you need basically good cookery lessons, and people
okay,
never,
okay,
and that's very important.
right,
So,
right,
they need people like my wife made latkes for Hanukkah with chia, which altogether are wonderful. We're enormously tasty and bind. People just don't know what these things are, so
true.
we need to be able to get these methods, these means, and these products more known to our
Yes.
Western society and to educate people accordingly. But then again, so you need to invite them around. We need to have as many plant-based bake-out, food
Yeah.
outs, whatever, etc., and invite people to be able to taste them and see how wonderful it can be to have a plant-based diet.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's not the heart healthiest choice, but the vegan butter replacement is a perfect fallback for me so that I can
I
continue baking. I'm a fan of the chickpea liquid as an
Yes,
egg
yes,
replacer.
aquafaba.
Yes, I
Yeah, yeah,
love that. I was just
yeah,
telling friends about that because I do like to bake and I
yeah.
have been known for cookies and pastries and things of the past. So I have to veganize them and still entice people that all
Right.
right, they're not healthy. I'm not presenting them as health food, but
But
it's
there are
vegan
plenty
food.
of things that can actually do the job and be healthy. Aquafaba, for example,
Sure.
is actually quite healthy.
Yes.
And I was in a hotel in Vienna recently where they gave me butter that was essentially avocado. It was avocado-based butter, and it tastes very, very buttery.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
must have had something else in it, but I don't. But it was basically avocado.
Yeah, I'm just impressed with all the people out there who are doing the good work to create these alternative products. So on that note, what can you share with the audience as your favorite meal, snacks, food items, beverages, something to entice the not yet vegan listener into eating this way?
Gosh, that's rather a difficult one because I'm so lucky to have such a varied diet that is provided for me. So
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
I'm
let's say
very,
when
very,
you're
very
traveling,
lucky.
maybe what are some go-to items?
I would say what I really like is an alternative shakshuka for breakfast. So, a shakshuka is normally made with tomatoes, as you call them, tomatoes, peppers, and a lot of sauce in it, and usually it's with egg.
Hmm.
And of course, these days there is such a thing as an alternative eggs. You've got vegan eggs of actually quite impressive poached eggs and things that you can buy to be able to use. But what I like is to be able to make the shakshuka sauce, but to use uh, well, of course, you could use a tofu in it, which is certainly an alternative. But what I actually particularly like is falafel in it. Put falafel together with a shakshuka sauce, and that's a very lovely breakfast dish and very,
Wow,
very tasty.
that's so good. I love that.
And actually, it doesn't have to be a breakfast dish. It can be any time of the day.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been known to have potatoes, rice, lentils, chickpeas for breakfast. Why not?
Right. And if you really want to go overboard, you can do a shakshuka together with falafel, mushrooms, and tofu, all in one.
So good. And you feel good afterwards. You're still not, even with all that, you're not loaded down, bloated. Yeah,
Absolutely, that always.
right?
Right. My wife makes a wonderful tofu lemon cheesecake, and she uses silken tofu
Hmm.
and together with lemons, and that's really really lovely. And has a sort of a biscuit base. And
Hmm.
people who come are really, really wowed by that. I mean, because it tastes quite sort of cheesy, and
Mm.
they're quite impressed with that. Another wonderful dessert is an avocado mousse. Now, people don't normally think of avocado as a dessert, and you therefore whip this up with some vegan cream, and it becomes a lovely mousse to be able to serve as a dessert.
Wow.
I mean, you're going to need to put something sweet in as well, but.
Yeah. Some cocoa powder could make it
You could,
chocolatey.
yeah, I like chocolate. She doesn't. So I'm quite happy for it just to be pure
Wow.
avocado mousse. And of course, I forgot an important ingredient, and that's the lime juice. The lime
Mm.
juice that goes in together with the avocado and the
Wow.
vegan cream and sugar, and it's very tasty.
I'll have to look into that one. That sounds great. Thank you for sharing those. Is there anywhere that you would like to direct the listeners to learn more about you and your work?
Well, actually, I'm quite antediluvian. I'm a bit of a dinosaur, so I don't really have all the mod cons that one really should have if one wants to get one's work out to the wider public. But I do have a rather limited website, which people are very welcome to go and visit, which is rabbidavidrosen.net.
All right, perfect. Well, this has been such a treat and just really such an honor to be in your presence. Parting words then, what message would you like to leave this audience with from a religious standpoint?
We're here in this world for a very little amount of time, and we've got to do as much good as we can while we're here and tread as lightly upon this wonderful earth as we can, and create a little more love and compassion than there was when we came into it. And we can do this in so many different ways, but probably the most profound impact upon our world and upon our environment and upon our own health is the dietary life we lead. And nothing can contribute to that in such a positive way as a plant-based diet.
So good. Thank you so much. I wish you all the best in all your future endeavors.
Thank you, Jenny, and to you.
What a treat it was to be schooled by Rabbi David Rosen. Such a brilliant man. Now, let me get into the juicy bits from this episode. Number one, kosher laws may reduce suffering, but there's still suffering and cruelty going on in kosher slaughterhouses. So that is something to consider. Number two, if you're benefiting from something you wouldn't want to do yourself, is it right to benefit from that same action when others do it for you? And that's a question that comes up amongst vegans all the time. In fact, in the last episode, Gary Yourofsky presented the same kind of scenario, that if someone asked him if he himself, with his hands, had to go outside and slaughter his own cow in order to have a burger, would he do it? And he most certainly would not. Number three, and this is such a powerful quote, there's enough food for human need, but not enough for human greed. Wow. And here I'll reference my conversation with Dr. Frank Sabatino several weeks ago when we talked about the issue of food insecurity worldwide and the staggering number of people who die of hunger every single day, thousands of which are children. If we simply took the food that's grown and give it directly to people, then we would cut out this hugely inefficient middleman, that being the animal agriculture industry. Number four, environmental problems like climate change and pollution can feel really overwhelming, like there's nothing we can do because the problem is just too big. And yes, recycling and trying not to waste things are great ideas. However, nothing compares to the impact of going vegan. Number five, animal product consumption is a drug. We've heard this come up several times on this show. In fact, Gary just mentioned it in the last episode. People are addicted to eating meat and dairy. And breaking an addiction is hard and uncomfortable. But it's what we do when we want to cut a bad habit out of our lives. We go through that discomfort. Number six, the Garden of Eden is portrayed in the book of Genesis as the ideal society. Adam and Eve are given all the vegetation they could possibly need to survive. Meat eating only shows up in the Bible after humanity has corrupted itself. Interesting to note. Number seven, we should strive as people, to the degree we're able, to live as good a life as we can. That means the less destruction, pain, and suffering we cause, the healthier we will be, and the healthier the environment will be. Number eight, it's difficult to live a modern life and be completely free of any connection to exploitation. I get that. And people will call me out on hypocrisy all the time, that if you care so much about animals, why are you wearing clothing that came from slave labor and unfair working conditions? I get it. I am aware and working toward doing better. And that's Rabbi David's point. We should strive to do our best whenever possible. The intention to do better should be there. Number nine, the problem with animal agriculture is not just the slaughter itself, it's everything leading up to it. The way the animals are treated, confined, force-fed, transported, separated from their friends and babies. There's so much more than the actual moment of death. Number 10, let's talk about the word dominion that shows up in the Bible. The fact that God created something doesn't mean it's ours as humans to exploit. Dominion means having responsibility for the well-being and flourishing of these other beings, just like a king over his kingdom, just like a boss over employees. It's not abuse and exploitation, it's nurturing and being kind. Number 11, if you don't care about the environment and the well-being of humanity and all sentient life, you are not truly honoring God as creator and guide of the universe. Number 12, Rabbi David's favorite foods include an alternate version of shakshuka with falafel, mushrooms, and tofu instead of eggs. And he also talked about a silken tofu lemon cheesecake and avocado mousse. Amazing. And finally, number 13. And these are really words to live by, words that are so poetic coming from a rabbi. We're in this world for very little time, and we've got to do as much good as we can and tread as lightly as we can. and create more love and compassion than was there previously. And we can do this in a lot of ways, but the most impactful way is by being vegan. So I'm sending so much gratitude to Rabbi David Rosen for sharing this spectacular wisdom with us. And I'm thankful to you, the listener. It would mean so much if you would take a moment to give this podcast a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple. And you can also write a short review on Apple Podcasts. That would be so helpful. And please be a subscriber on whatever platform you choose and on YouTube. I hope you'll share this episode with all of your friends, but especially the ones who consider themselves religious or followers of a faith. I will see you right back here in 2 weeks for my April 1st interview with the beautiful and passionate Ray Sikora. Her story is so powerful, I can't wait to share it. And for now, it is with a heart full of gratitude and a fridge full of veggies. I send you peace, love, and chickpeas. Mwah!